Hello, I'm going to try and do an introduction to 1 Peter now, and that, to you might just sound, yeah, well, it's another book, and, Richard's been doing these things for ages, and yeah, but I want to say to you that it's not as easy as it sounds. There are 2 Peter letters. 1 Peter's really packed, it's really detailed, it's really helpful, and it's got a different feel to Paul or to James, but the theological unity is very much there. More to the point, Peter challenges our attitudes at various levels, and in that way that the New Testament often does, asks us to go against the grain, to go against some of our natural feelings, inclinations and drives, even some that we might feel are positive. Anyway, I'm going to try and go through the substance of this letter, and you'll see what I mean by being tightly packed. Peter starts off, he talks about the Christian hope, what it's about and where it comes from. He calls us to an active and holy faith. We often think about love being the primary driver, but holiness is a very big thing in the New Testament, and it's a big thing for Peter. He's got a big vision for the holiness of God's people, based upon the eternal Word of God, and especially the prophets, and we'll come to that much more when we get to 2 Peter and Jude. We're called, as this holy church, to be a holy people, to be living stones built together in unity, therefore, loving one another deeply from the heart, within the church. Our challenge is we often try to stretch these things out into society as a whole, which at one level, of course, is true. We're always supposed to be a loving people, but first and foremost loving each other. If people say, oh, well, the church is just there to go and do stuff in the community, actually they've taught the opposite of what the New Testament actually says. We've got to start by building up the relationships within God's people as the community of faith, but as a holy people. The attitudes and behaviour of the church are very important. It's not just, oh, well, love, so anything goes. What are we there to do? We're to reflect Jesus, God, to the nations. The way that the church acts and responds is very important. And we are to declare the praises of him who called us out of darkness into his wonderful light. Everybody's responsibility, not a chosen caste. We're all a royal priesthood, a holy nation. We're in it together. And all of us do this by turning to God first. Salvation is the goal of our faith, and baptism is an essential part of it. But God has no grandchildren. We all need to make that decision to turn to Christ. In submission and not rebellion, we submit to the governing authorities. We submit to each other. We submit in our roles without it in any way compromising our status before God. Our value before God is not in any way reflected by the roles that we have in life. That's a very difficult thing to grab hold of, because we naturally assume that if we've got a better job title, or that we are in what we perceive to be a more dominant role or controlling role in a relationship, that makes us better than somebody else. That is not remotely the case in the New Testament, and certainly not in Peter's thinking. what he says is, if you hit trouble, make sure it wasn't your fault. Do not be afraid of the consequences of doing the right thing and of being the right thing. If that means being in submission, don't be afraid of that. But make sure that that means that you're only going to get punished if you really did do something wrong. And if you get ill treatment when you haven't done something wrong, do you know you're being blessed? That's a hard thing to grasp a hold of. But later on in the letter, Peter's actually going to say, when you're persecuted, that's a blessing. Which again, goes completely against the grain. But Jesus said something very similar, and Peter really did listen to Jesus in the end. And our attitude in the middle of all of this is to be considerate, to be compassionate, to bless and not to curse, to put Jesus first. So we're a devoted people here. And all of this leads to a collection of countercultural behaviours which on their own might cause us to be disapproved of by those around us. And Peter just says, yeah, but carry on anyway. And then he flips up briefly out of humility and humble service into going directly into leadership and saying leadership actually needs to be light touch. Now, I don't know what you think of my leadership or of the ministerial colleagues that I work with, but our calling, yes, is to shepherd the flock. Now, what does that mean? Well, actually, the flock, fundamentally, I'm afraid, if we think about shepherds, look after itself most of the time. What the shepherds do is lead it and guard it. And yes, when the flock, members of the flock wander off, go and get it. Give it the chance to come back. What shepherds don't do is lord it over the flock, use the position of power to feed greed. There's nothing exploitative about leadership. It's a humble thing. And that means that the flock have a responsibility to be the flock, to be the living stones that fit together into that temple not built by hands. The whole flock has the responsibility of being a royal priesthood, even if people like myself are appointed as elders to shepherd that flock and to watch over it. But our ultimate humility is to humble ourselves before God. And as we do so, of course, one of the aspects of humility is casting all our cares on him because he cares for us. There's an aspect of humility. You see, if we're proud, we think we can deal with it ourselves. We think that's about independence or autonomy. Well, actually, independence or autonomy from God is sin. Why wouldn't God be able to deal with it better than us? What makes us so good that we can deal with it without him? Cast our cares on him, because he does care for us. He wants to help. But in love, of course, he needs us to submit ourselves to him so he can. And when we do that, we will be resisting the devil. The way to please the devil is to sit in judgment over our lives and to try and run our lives ourselves without reference to God. And so God is able to restore and renew us by his power when we give him that opportunity, and he wants to, because he wants us to stand fast in his service and in his peace. So a lot of detail in 1 Peter, a lot of encouragements, a lot of challenges. It's a wonderful letter, and I hope that you will take the trouble to read it and reread it and enjoy.